Welcome to the Get Started with Azure AI Services learning path. This module covers Deploy Azure AI Services in Containers. Unit 1. Introduction. Containers enable you to host Azure AI Services either on-premises or in Azure. For example, if your application uses sensitive data in an on-premises SQL server to call an Azure AI Services service, you can deploy Azure AI Services in containers on the same network. Now your data can stay on your local network and not be passed to the cloud. Deploying Azure AI Services in a container on premises will also decrease the latency between the service and your local data, which can improve performance. In this module, you'll learn how to create containers for reuse, deploy to a container and secure a container, consume Azure AI Services from a container. Unit 2. Understand containers. When you deploy a software service, it must be hosted in an environment that provides the hardware operating system and supporting runtime components on which the service depends. Azure AI Services is provided as a cloud service, in which the service software is hosted in an Azure data center that provides the underlying runtime services, operating system, and hardware. However, you can also deploy some Azure AI Services in a container, which encapsulates the necessary runtime components and which is in turn deployed in a container host that provides the underlying operating system and hardware. What is a container? A container comprises an application or service and the runtime components needed to run it, while abstracting the underlying operating system and hardware. In practice, this abstraction results in two significant benefits. Containers are portable across hosts, which may be running different operating systems or use different hardware, making it easier to move an application and all its dependencies. A single container host can support multiple isolated containers, each with its own specific runtime configuration, making it easier to consolidate multiple applications that have different configuration requirement. A container is encapsulated in a container image that defines the software and configuration it must support. Images can be stored in a central registry, such as Docker Hub, or you can maintain a set of images in your own registry. Container deployment. To use a container, you typically pull the container image from a registry and deploy it to a container host, specifying any required configuration settings. The container host can be in the cloud, in a private network, or on your local computer. For example, a Docker server, an Azure Container Instance, ACI, an Azure Kubernetes Service, AKS cluster. Docker is an open-source solution for container development and management that includes a server engine that you can use to host containers. There are versions of the Docker server for common operating systems, including Microsoft Windows and Linux. Tip to learn more about containers. Review the Introduction to Docker Containers module on Microsoft Learn. Unit 3. Use Azure AI Services containers. There are container images for Azure AI Services in the Microsoft Container Registry that you can use to deploy a containerized service that encapsulates an individual Azure AI Services service API. To deploy and use an Azure AI Services container, the following three activities must occur. The container image for the specific Azure AI Services API you want to use is downloaded and deployed to a container host, such as a local Docker server, an Azure Container Instance, ACI, or Azure Kubernetes Service, AKS. Client applications submit data to the endpoint provided by the containerized service and retrieve results just as they would from an Azure AI Services cloud resource in Azure. Periodically, usage metrics for the containerized service are sent to an Azure AI Services resource in Azure in order to calculate billing for the service. Even when using a container, you must provision an Azure AI Services resource in Azure for billing purposes. Client applications send their requests to the containerized service, meaning that potentially sensitive data is not sent to the Azure AI Services endpoint in Azure, but the container must be able to connect to the Azure AI Services resource in Azure periodically to send usage metrics for billing. Azure AI Services container images. Each container provides a subset of Azure AI Services functionality. For example, not all features of the Azure AI language service are in a single container. Language detection, translation, and sentiment analysis are each separate container images. However, the setup steps are similar for each container. Language containers for the AI language service, the core features map to separate images. Note sentiment. Analysis supports other languages by replacing theme in the image with the correct language code, speech containers, vision containers. You can use the Docker pull command to download container images to work with them directly from your machine. Some of the containers are in a gated public preview state, and you need to explicitly request access to use them. Otherwise, the containers are available for anyone to use with their Azure AI Services deployment. For a full list of currently available Azure AI Services container images and specific notes for each one, see Azure AI Services container image tags and release notes. Azure AI Services container configuration. When you deploy an Azure AI Services container image to a host, you must specify 3 settings. Consuming Azure AI Services from a container. After your Azure AI Services container is deployed, applications consume the containerized Azure AI Services endpoint rather than the default Azure endpoint. The client application must be configured with the appropriate endpoint for your container, but does not need to provide a subscription key to be authenticated. You can implement your own authentication solution and apply network security restrictions as appropriate for your specific application scenario. Unit 5. Knowledge Check. Question 1. You plan to use an Azure AI Services container in a local Docker host. Which of the following statements is true? A. Client applications must pass a subscription key to the Azure Resource Endpoint before using the container. B. The container must be able to connect to the Azure Resource Endpoint to send usage data for billing. C. All data passed from the client application to the container is forwarded to the Azure Resource Endpoint. Question 2. Which of the following parameters must you specify when deploying an Azure AI Services container image? A. EULA. B. Resource group. C. Subscription name. Question 3. You plan to use the language detection functionality of Azure AI Language in a container. Which container image should you deploy? A. mcr.microsoft.com/azure-ai-services/text-analytics. B. mcr.microsoft.com/azure-ai-services. C. mcr.microsoft.com/azure-ai-services/text-analytics/language. Unit 6. Summary. In this module, you learned how to create containers for reuse, deploy to a container and secure a container, consume Azure AI Services from a container. For more information about AI Services containers, see Azure AI Services containers in the AI Services documentation.